fucking morning, goddammit. Today I want to talk a little bit about program design. You know, there is this concept of functional movement patterns or basic movement patterns on which most programs should be based on. So this includes the basic movement patterns, which are push, pull, lunge, squat, hinge, gate, and twist. So 7 movement patterns. Then you can also say, okay, you got the vertical and the horizontal pull and the vertical and the horizontal push. For example, bench press is horizontal push, overhead press is vertical, and then you got pull-ups, which is vertical pull, and rows are horizontal pulls. Now you should include at least one of each movement in your program to have like a functional program. This is a good concept, but it's a little too basic in my opinion, because it is missing one basic movement pattern, which is hip flexion. You see, when you squat, hinge or lunge, even though the hip is flexed, the force is always hip extension. So the muscles that are working are the glutes, usually the glutes, the prime movers, and those are hip extensors, right? So hip flexion is completely neglected, and that is a problem. Why? Because in most people the hip flexors are too weak, because people sit all day. They sit in the car, they sit on their motorbike, they sit in front of their laptop, they sit 8 hours a day behind the desk on their job. So the hip flexors are constantly in that shortened position, which makes them weak and inhibited. And if then you do a strength program or a hypertrophy program, you may develop trigger points in those hip flexors, especially if you're dealing with a hip impingement like I do. So recently I'm walking down the street and I got this sudden sharp pains in my right groin, which is basically the opposing side of my hip, in which I got an impingement. So I figured, how come? And I treated my psoas, which is the main hip flexor, and guess what? There's a serious trigger point in my right psoas. And I'll show you in a minute how to treat the psoas. Because it's not just rolling on the foam roller, rolling the hip flexors on the foam roller can release a little bit of the tension in the iliacus. That's one part of the iliopsoas. So those are basically two muscles. So you got the iliacus and the psoas called together the iliopsoas. But you cannot really reach the psoas with a foam roller. I was doing hanging leg raises and on my previous program, but then I stopped doing those because it was really aggravating my golfer's elbow. Even hanging with straps at the pull-up bar for like 20 to 30 reps, it's a long time, you know. You're hanging there for quite a long time, and it just puts too much tension on my wrist flexors. So I stopped doing those, and then I started doing floor exercises like lower abdominal exercises. So that's basically for the hip flexors. And I'm gonna start doing those again on my assistance day now, because seriously, it's just because I stopped doing hip flexor exercises that now I developed this trigger point in my right psoas, because it's just too weak. Okay, so let me show you how to treat the psoas before you start exercising it. Because if a muscle has trigger points, it's basically, I'm not gonna say impossible, but it's very hard to make it stronger. You gotta try to get rid of the trigger point first before you start really strengthening the muscle. But yeah, that doesn't mean you cannot do any strengthening exercises. You can do some hip flexion exercises on the floor without completely excruciating yourself. You just want to treat the trigger point first before you do strengthening exercises, and preferably you start with high rep strengthening exercises, not all the way to failure, because that could actually aggravate that trigger point, the tension in that muscle. You know, you first just, you want to stimulate blood flow so that the muscle can relax and the trigger point can dissipate. Now it may take weeks or even months before the trigger point is completely gone. Alright, so let me show you how to treat the psoas first. So I use my foam roller, but you can use a pillow or whatever. Anything that allows your knee to be lifted off the floor for a little bit without you having to use your muscles. So I put my knee on the foam roller like that. Both legs put together. So you got this area available for treatment. So now it's open, it's completely relaxed with your legs in hip flexion. So what you're gonna do, so the psoas is actually running from your belly button, well, underneath your belly button against the spine. It goes all the way down into your groin. So if you are an athlete with groin pain, it's often due to a weak psoas. So what you want to do to treat the trigger points is you find the belly button and go to the right or to the left if you're treating the other leg, but I'm treating my right leg right now. So I move my hand to the right about, what's that, 5 centimeter, 2 inches, next to the abs, right next to the abs, and then you crunch so that your abs contract, and you press in there right next to the abs, and there you feel this band running, and that is your psoas. When you feel that band, then you know you're on the psoas. And then you just go down with your fingers, following the band until you find that trigger point, and you will feel it because it can be very tender and it's sending referred pain to the groin when you hit it. And now when you found it, it can also be more than one trigger point, but when you found one, you just press on it and give it like 10 to 12 strokes. Like that. It can be really deep, you know. It can be really deep. Yeah. And really sensitive. But sometimes you gotta go really deep in order to feel it. I find the psoas easier to find on my left side than on my right side, but the right side definitely has trigger points. The left side seems to be okay. It's a little tender too, but it's not like I cannot what's the word? I cannot feel referred pain to my groin on the left side, but on the right side I totally do. Ten to 12 strokes is enough, and then I go a little bit lower to find if there's more. I actually only find one real trigger point in there, and if you need to treat your iliacus, you can do that with your thumbs, like that. Sometimes I even use one thumb on top of the other to put more pressure while massaging the iliacus like that. Deep in that muscle, right against the bone. Yeah, very, very tender here too. So also, yeah, I make these small rotations, 10 to 12 times, and you can do that for 3 times a day. That should be enough. And preferably before stretching or before a workout. Because you see, if you stretch a trigger point, if you stretch a muscle with a trigger point, it can also make it worse. So I would be careful with the stretching. Don't stretch too intense, and definitely not without treating the trigger point first, because it's like a muscle knot, you know. If you pull the muscle on both sides of the knot, you just tighten even more. But if you release the knot first and then you pull softly, then you can actually increase blood flow. But don't pull too hard, don't stretch too intense. And also before working out, because, well, especially if you're working the legs, you're working your glutes, it's an antagonist of the glutes, so if it's too tensed, it could be inhibiting a full glute contraction as well. So it could actually decrease your performance. Alright, so this is it. I hope that helps for you, for those who are dealing with groin pain. And I will see you next time, which is tomorrow, for shoulders and back.